Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. At the age of 24, with only a camera and a held hand GPS unit, Anthony Acciavatti left the New York City to map the most densely populated river basin in the world, River Ganga. Over the next decade, he began to obsessively record the cycles of the monsoons and the dynamism of Ganga River, developing new ways of visualizing this iconic river basin. Dr. Anthony Acciavatti is the author of Ganges Water Machine, Designing New India's Ancient River, I beg your pardon, published in 2015, became the first comprehensive mapping and urban history of the Ganga River Basin in over half a century. The Ganges Basin is mediated through an incisive combination of media, from photography to paintings, technical drawings, cartography, diagrams, indexes, and sketches. In 2016, the book was awarded the John Brinkerhoff Jackson Book Prize. Trained in architecture at the Rhode Island School of Design and Harvard University, and in the history of science at Princeton, our master speaker today, Dr. Acciavatti, currently teaches at Yale University. He is a principal of Somatic Collaborative in New York. The Digital Arts Forum is our design and art community that will lead the change for the next epoch as we find ourselves at the intersection of technology, art, science, sustainability, and design. It covers all forms of digital design and art, from fashion design to virtual reality to art and architecture. Integral to this digital arts community is Forum Days. I welcome you all to this most happening weekday seminars for the creative community. Master speakers from across the world share insights on the cutting edge of design and technology. There is a brief technology interlude as well, fireside chat, followed by of free-flowing discussion and conversations. The idea is to generate collaborative knowledge and projects that span multiple disciplines, catalyzed by this new thinking and knowledge. Here is an opportunity to learn, interact, share, and discover. With this, I request my colleague Deepak to run the introduction AV. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. Acciavatti speaking on the values of imprecision, visualizing River Gangah's dynamism. Professor.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction. Are you all able to see my screen?
Yes, please.
Okay. So again, thank you so much for the invitation. It's really wonderful to be with all of you this evening as part of Scotch's Digital Arts Forum. I am particularly thankful to Mr. Samir Kochar, as well as Rohan Kochar, and of course also to Shanil Malik for the introduction. I've enjoyed seeing the programming that you all have been doing, and it's really wonderful to be here. This evening, then, I'm going to speak about what I call the values of imprecision. Now, in particular, I'll speak about why we would do well, really, to be less precise in the way that we engage one of the greatest and most dynamic river basins on the planet, which is the River Ganga. So to that end, I'm going to speak about work from my book on Ganga titled Ganges Water Machine, Designing New India's Ancient River. Now, it's a big book, 400 pages, several thousand images, and there's absolutely no way I could possibly talk about it in 20 minutes, so I'm not going to even try. So instead, what I'd like to talk about really are the layers of history, culture, geology, meteorology, climate, that all go in to trying to visualize this incredibly dynamic river basin. So I'd like to begin with a very kind of straightforward question, which is, why write a book to visualize these layers of the Ganga River Basin? And the very kind of simple answer is because words and numbers fail to capture the dynamism and deep rhythms of this monsoonal landscape. So my job was really to try to develop a new way of imaging this landscape, not just chronologically, so let's say how it's developed over time every year, but also cyclically, how it changes every year with the dynamism of the monsoons. So I really look at three major aspects of the river basin: monsoon, population density, and agriculture. Now, because I don't have time to talk about how I look at the history of this river basin, it means that I'm not going to tell you about, for example, how James Rennell, working for the East India Company, wrote in 1781 a really brilliant description of how the vapors of the monsoons are wafted from the Bay of Bengal, run into the Himalayas, and drench the landscape and radically transform this basin. Yet when he had to make a map, Rennell made a map like this, where Ganga is drawn as two parallel lines, streets are just one line, and cities are dots. And the reason for that is because colonialism and imperialism require us to flatten space. That thick description that he developed needed to be flattened in order to take taxes, move armies. But this history of flattening space that comes from imperialism and colonialism still shapes the way that not only we look at space and rivers in India, but all across the world. So my job was really to try to understand these layers and thicken this kind of mapping project. It also means that, for example, I won't tell you too much about, say, the incredible yatra maps that I collected all throughout the basin, especially in the Himalayas, where here you see all of these mandirs and sacred sites for so many Hindus in the lower and upper Himalayas, yet in no way do you see Tari Dam or all of the infrastructure that's been put in place to divert and create new artificial rivers from existing rivers within the basin. And what I will, though, talk to you about is how all of this gets even more complicated by population density. As so many of you know, UP, Uttar Pradesh, if it was a nation, it would be the 7th most populous country in the world. That means that it has 200 million people living in an area the size of Great Britain, and it produces almost 20% of all of India's food grains. It's an incredibly diverse and rich state, which of course is really in the center so much of the work that I've been doing on Ganga. And of course, you can see in this map from the irrigation works of UP just how incredibly stratified it is by rivers, nalas, irrigation systems, etc. So I'm trying to understand all of these rich layers of this river basin, and I'll speak about why the work that I do engages in a certain kind of imprecision, so that the drawings that I make to visualize the Ganga remain contemporary as opposed to outdated so quickly, which is oftentimes what happens with these kinds of cartographic maps like you see here. So I would say that oftentimes the way that Ganga is discussed is, say, this BBC News, Ganges, India's dying mother, where we see a hazy image like this with that flyover in the background. The BBC correspondent is choking because of the smell that's coming from the Nala. And oftentimes then we are spoken about and or spoken to and are shown technologies like, say, the Tata Swatch in terms of purifying waters, or and ways in which we might start to fix them as a way to address this pollution issue. Or development experts love these kind of life straws where somebody sticks the straw into the polluted water and sucking on it, clean potable water comes out at the end. Or any number of aqua guards, right, that we find in so many homes and businesses throughout the basin. But for me, all of these technological fixes actually produce this. This is a scene of a urinal standing by itself in Allahabad, or what's now been renamed Prayagraj, near the Sangam. And you can see that it's literally a urinal that just goes out into the commons. And so for me, all of these technologies, they just repeat what you see right here. And if we don't think about this as part of a larger common, as part of a larger system, the social, the cultural, the political, and certainly all of those ecological layers, we will continue to produce these kinds of responses to the dynamism and radically changing conditions of the basin. So my job was to really take and draw a kind of middle layer, not fly 50,000 feet above the surface of the earth, and not kind of level of a 5'11" person, but instead, how do these two big and small all come together? How do we start to redraw the commons? And so the drawings and the instruments I'm going to share with you are attempts at trying to do that. Now, it's important that I take you back to 2004, because in 2004 is when I really began doing this work. And just as a bit of biography, imagine it's 2004. The best books I can find on Ganga are, say, photo essays by the esteemed Indian photographer Raghuveer Singh, madcap adventures like Eric Newby's Slowly Down the Ganges, where he travels the length of the river and his wife divorces him at the end of the book because she's fed up with the trip. Or Histories of Cartography by Matthew Edney, or irrigation projects in India, this kind of avalanche of numbers. And for me, as an architect and historian of science, I wanted to know, how do people live and shape space in such a dynamic landscape? Because I think there's something to be learned from this. So I wrote a Fulbright proposal to go to India to develop a new system of imaging this landscape. Now, it's 2004, so Google Earth is just going live, extremely low resolution of India. Drones existed, but certainly not, I didn't have access to them. They were being used, especially by the US government, to nefarious ends in Iraq and Afghanistan. So I didn't have access to these. The GRACE satellite system, which maps groundwater across the world in relationship to gravity, was so low resolution that it would be very useless for me to try to use those kinds of satellite images. So all that I came to India with on a Fulbright was this clunky Garmin eTrex handheld GPS that you see here and a Nikon camera to develop what I call a dynamic atlas. So how do you start to image the choreography of people, water, soils, agriculture across this landscape? Now, when I got to India, I hoped that I might find contemporary maps, but it turned out the Survey of India hadn't really mapped the area for close to half a century. And in fact, when I would ask if I could see contemporary maps, I would most often be asked if I worked for the CIA. Of course, I didn't work for the CIA, nor have I, but nonetheless, I had to go out and really develop my own cartographic tools. So I literally had to walk the length of the river. And so I'm showing you these photos, not because of how bad I look with long hair in a dust storm in UP, but because I had to be a barefoot hydrographer, architect, cartographer, historian in order to image this landscape over time. And so I went from Gangotri Glacier at Gomukh, like you see here, almost 4,000 meters above sea level, going through the Gangetic Plains, snapping some 25,000 photographs and near continuous panorama of the basin. And the book stops all the way at the city of Varanasi. And of course, I continued the trip all the way into Bihar and eventually much further down. And so today I'm going to talk about how I use the techniques of cartography, architecture, and photography to image the dynamism of this landscape. And in particular, I'm going to focus on a city where I spent a great deal of my time, the city of Allahabad or Prayagraj, which is right at the confluence of Ganga, Jamuna, and for some Saraswati. As you can see in this satellite image, Ganga is to the north. It's this incredibly braided river, and we see Yamuna to the south. And of course, where these two rivers meet is said to be one of the most sacred sites in Hinduism. Now, I was interested in coming to this site because it's not only where two major river basins meet, but also where an incredible, of course, festival happens every year and every 12 to 13 years with the Kumbh. So what I did was I visited this area, and the best drawings that I could find of this were the calendar art that you find here. And what I love about these drawings, like this Tirthraj Prayag that you see here, is that we see all of the layers of the city brought together. We of course see Saraswati, Ganga, Jamuna, but we also see a South Indian mandir, we see Akbar Kila, we see a mosque, we see a church, a railway station, the terrestrial and the celestial all coming together. And I took inspiration from the way in which these drawings bring together all of these different layers to image this dynamic landscape. Now, of course, when one goes to the Sangam, one can see the blue waters of the Jamuna and the gray-brown waters of the Ganga. And of course, this site is constantly moving. It's never stable. So my goal was, how do I take inspiration from this constantly moving site, and how do I draw it? How do I not make it static in my understanding of the basin, but how do I draw how it expands and contracts every year? So with no maps of Allahabad, I had to go out and develop my own drawings of the city. And so I'm going to walk you through these drawings that I made of cartography and photography of the basin. So to the left, you can see Ganga and those tones of violet that you see around Allahabad. That's how Ganga and Jamuna expand and contract, not just in this direction, but also in this direction every year. And then you'll see all of the layers of the city. To the right, you're going to see photographs that I took every week for one full year, where I would go and visit the Sangam to photograph it as a kind of panorama, to capture the social and political changes that happened there over the course of a single year. So those tones of violet correspond to moments in relationship to the solstices and the equinoxes. So let me show you what I mean by that. So if these are all of those tones of violet, how the rivers expand and contract over the course of a year, imagine that it's the month of April. This is what Ganga and Jamuna look like in Allahabad. By May, they start to expand like you see here. June, with the monsoons, expanding even more. August, September, you can see how incredibly large and expansive they become. I draw all of the nalas and the canals. I draw all of the settlement. I then draw all of the roadways. And I bring all of those layers together so that I have a much fuller picture of how these layers intersect with one another, like you see here. But then I would also go and photograph at the Sangam every week. And of course, during Jan and Feb, the Magh Mela occurs, like you see here, where between 2 and 3 million people camp out at the Sangam. And so I photographed that temporary city with all of its roadways and electricity lines and draw the layers of it. But to me, what's quite amazing is that when this festival is over, the grid of the city remains tattooed on the banks of the river and on its sandbars, and farmers move in and they use it for agriculture. So it goes from being hyper urban and dense to agricultural and bucolic in 2 weeks. Farmers harvest their crops, the monsoons come, and they wash all of it away. And so it's this incredible dance with the monsoons. It is the most intelligent use of urban space I've ever witnessed in my life, anywhere on the planet, but it's never been drawn and it's never been written about. And so if these things are not drawn, if they're not written, how are we able to build upon them? Because I think this intelligence is not only something that India can build upon, but it's what other parts of the world can learn from as well. So these drawings are some of the first to really draw out these layers and that dynamism. They've been they're not only in my book, but also made it as part of the Quito Papers, the UN Habitat New Urban Agenda from 2017. And these drawings that I make, I would say that if you think about them like fashion, they're not so much like couture, like what you get during wedding season, right? Where they're made to fit your body exactly for the day you get married. But instead, they're more like H&M or Zara. They're ready to wear. So you gain a few kilos, lose a few kilos, they still fit because they really show the dynamism of the river basin and the cities that exist here. Now, of course, this isn't only a site for Magh Mela, also, of course, the Kumbh happens. So these are photographs that I took from 2013 with all those bundles that you see here, the pontoon bridges. But for me, what's more amazing than this 24-hour city with 4 to 6 million people permanently there and an estimated 80 to 100 million people passing through it is that it goes from this to in 2 weeks, this. As the farmers move in, they use that land. The water table level is so shallow because of all of that silt that they're able to irrigate their crops through just having to dig less than half a meter. The roads and avenues of the temporary city become the lines for agriculture. And here you can see the imprint left by the tents on the sandbars that are eventually going to be washed away. So it's a drawing at the scale of the territory. And again, this happens every year and has to be recalibrated in relationship to the dynamism of the river. So this temporality is something that I try to capture in all of my work. And of course, it's not just a space for agriculture and religion, it's also a space for recreation. I love this image here because we see all of these water buffalo wallas along with pujas taking place, swimming, navwalas are here, etc., all within this very tight space. It's this wonderful mixed use urban space. And of course, it's also a space where there's an incredible amount of illegal extraction of sand mining that happens within the region as well. So there's also an extractiveness that happens with these soils. But these soils also can tell us a story. So in order to map this area, I had to develop my own instruments to map especially soils, because soils can tell us so much about the behavior of the river. And so that's what I'm going to end this talk with, are those instruments that I made that engage in an imprecise form of measure. So one instrument that I made was what I call the surface accumulation sleeve. It's literally a prosthetic you put over your arm, like you see here. You can see that Garmin handheld GPS unit here. And then I attach packaging tape to it. And even back in 2005, a space for my Nokia mobile phone. And what I would do was I would take this instrument and I would triangulate where I was using the satellite system that the GPS tracks me with, to geolocate myself in the Ganga Basin. And then I would take a soil sample. So I literally would go perpendicular to the river edge for 1 kilometer in order to pick up surface soil samples. It's a little bit like, Spider-Man shoots his web from his wrist. Well, my instrument shoots packaging tape from my arm in order to collect these soils. And so I would leave an imprint 1 kilometer long, like you see here. And so I would pick up these soils to analyze their size, to tell me about the behaviors of the river. Now, a friend of mine told me that this is very much like Katamari Damacy, which is this fantastic game made for Nintendo in 2003 about this little prince who's trying to build a new galaxy. And so he has these little balls like you see here, where different detritus from spoons and paper clips stick to the ball. But the idea is to build new planets and new galaxies. So they start to grow. So you see jungle gyms, and they get even to the size of a city. Well, my instrument doesn't just collect soil. It collects human hair follicles, car parts, plastics. It allows me to do a kind of ethnography of this area so that I can tell a larger story of the river basin in terms of the practices of inhabitation. And so this is an example of a further iteration of this surface accumulation sleeve that I made as a wearable prosthetic. And what I would do was I scanned all of these rolls of tape. They get really quite large. And so I would scan the rolls of tape in order to break down the soil samples so that I could better understand their size, to understand the behaviors of the river. Now, I didn't have access to any fancy technology, so I literally used the magic wand tool in Photoshop. So I used the wrong thing for the right reason. So it's a kind of do-it-yourself remote sensing. So Magic Wand, for those of you that might not be familiar with it, you can use Magic Wand to do something like this. Say you want to place a dragon tattoo on someone's chest, you can do it like this. But I misuse Magic Wand to actually pull apart the soil conditions like you see here so that I can map the area out. And I do all of this to image this landscape. And of course, I also developed another system, which I call the Ganga Dip Sock, which is where I bought 100 pairs of white socks that I would then use to collect soil samples. So I would literally plunge them into the silt of the river to collect the soil, with the idea that I would place them in their plastic sleeves that I bought them in. And if I got asked at a certain moment at customs, why do you have all of these soiled socks? I would say, well, I was a filthy backpacker and I didn't have time to do my laundry, as a way to collect soil samples. So again, I had a limited means of collecting and analyzing these soils, but I had to be more inventive in the way that I went about doing this work. But it's this kind of using the wrong thing for the right reason that allows me to draw even larger segments of the river basin in the same way that I drew Allahabad. So these tones of violet that you see here of how Ganga expands and contracts, I'm using these instruments to image how it changes and morphs over time. I've made rovers out of remote control cars, like you see here. So repurposing a remote control car to become a surface accumulation rover as well. For this area. And I've exhibited it in places like the Nehru Science Center in Mumbai, where I have all of the drawings on display so that students and the public could come and look at them and look at the instruments, the animations and videos that I use to explain the dynamism of the river basin and certainly Gangah's descent, so that people can engage the space in different ways, to even an exhibition I did in New Delhi where mannequins were wearing my surface accumulation sleeve like you see here, and even soiled socks like you see here. So different ways of engaging a larger public with books and models as well. And certainly in Seoul, Korea, I exhibited the work there so that people could build their own maps, and even built little dioramas showing how, for example, the Ganga Dip Sock works in terms of how I use it to collect soil samples, dry it off, etc. And so I'm showing you all of this work because I'm trying to develop an imaging and understanding of the river basin from the scale of soil structures and the urban scale of, say, a city like Prayag and Varanasi to a larger regional scale. And I do all of this not just through my book, but op-eds in the Indian Express and the New York Times, as well as exhibitions and workshops. And I want to end with this because I think that it's really important that we engage different publics about the work that we do as designers, scholars, and those concerned about the environment, because you can be absolutely brilliant in the work that you do, but if you can't share it, you're going to lead a very lonely revolution. So for me, drawing and writing are critical to the work that I do. And I think we need both to understand these slow motion changes that occur across the Ganga River Basin, because otherwise I think we are likely to suffer the consequences of sight without the benefits of insight. So thank you very much for this opportunity to share my work, and I look forward to discussing it with all of you.
Well, Professor Anthony, this was really an amazing presentation. And you know what ceases to amaze me is your passion for the river, having trudged, I'm sure, you know, more than 1,000 miles right from the origin of the river right to the place Varanasi and down, having picked up on very specific nuances and documented them. And of course, you have picked up quite a few Hindi words and pronounced them very well. My congratulations to you. So we'll come back to you, you know, with more questions in between. Let me move over to our technology expert, Mr. Wilton Suresh. He is with HP as its category manager, looking into mobile workstation, virtual reality, data science, and strategic growth initiatives. He is into evangelist role, and he looks at primarily how to leverage technology to help increase output and convert creative ideas into reality and translate them better with the help of digital tools. I'm sure, you know, majority of work that you have done, Professor, you know, revolves around the conversion of ideas, translating them, and then with a little bit of application of digital tools. Wilton is speaking on technology as an enabler for creative pros. Over to you.
Thanks, Dr. Gurshan. Thanks, Mr. Samir. So fantastic, flabbergasted by the presentation of Professor Anthony. One thing, I mean, which comes to my mind, technology is not a limitation to a passion. You know, so whatever, I mean, whatever, and Mr. Anthony or Professor Anthony has done, you know, with and without the technology is amazing. And I'm sure today, even with the technology, the best of the technology is in hand, whether it is a drone cameras or whether it is, you know, GPS trackers and whatnot. I mean, people cannot achieve. So, I mean, there is nothing which comes, I mean, in front of passion. So having said that, so Ganga, as we call it as a mother Ganga, you know, for Indians, I mean, it's something wherein, I mean, since the inception or since when we have become independent, every government has promised that we wanted to do clean Ganga and we wanted to do, I mean, there are policies in place, but till today the situation is status quo. I mean, nothing has changed greatly except the population has grown, encroachment has grown, and so on and so forth. So there are projects which is going on, like for I have worked with on one of the project, prestigious project from government of India, which is like Navami Gange, wherein the you know, the government agencies wanted to do map complete the Ganga basin itself. I mean including 5 states. So Ganga, as we say, Ganga, it's not only the river, it's a complete ecosystem in itself. It has got both abiotic and biotic, you know, ecosystem, which includes your aquatic life, which includes your typical plant botanical ecosystem, which also has its own wildlife ecosystem, and so on and so forth. Till when we don't talk about preserving those ecosystem, I mean, we will not be able to successfully, you know, preserve the Ganga itself. And it's as we say, pran dayini. So Ganga is considered as life giving for Indians. So technology has already been incepted. You know, there is a lot of investment has already gone by the government of India in terms of acquiring the technology, mapping the Ganga basin, its tributaries, its distributaries. But still challenge remains the same, because the users, you know, technology is as smart as users are. So in terms of, you know, educating the users, you know, though we have got the best of the technologies available now, but at the same time users has to be educated how to use the GPS maps and how to read the GPS maps and how to deploy the solutions over a period of time. At the same time, we as an Indian, you know, take water for granted. I mean, it's not a resource for us. It's like something which is, as an Indian, it is given to us, and we, I mean, misbehave and misuses that resource. So having said that, the education plays an important role when it comes to, you know, for any water resource, whether as an Indian or as an any countryman. If we are educated in terms of how to conserve the resource, and water is going to be the biggest resource, and it is a biggest resource for us, technologically, we are doing a lot of things in terms of mapping the Ganga Basin using drone cameras, GIS maps, and so on and so forth. But still, there is a lot to be done. And as Dr. Arvind was talking about, 10 years down the line, we will be safe to take a dip in Kanpur and Ganga. And I'm crossing my fingers if that could have happened, in my lifetime. I mean, that's a blessing for me. I feel myself to be blessed. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much, Wilton. Less of technology and more of the possibilities that could be there if we apply technology on the work that we do. But yes, when technology wasn't there, research did happen. Then when technology wasn't there, the life did move on. And we have had, the traditional technologies deployed rather than the IT per se. But
True.
yes, the kind of work that, Professor Anthony has done, it's really, really remarkable. In fact, I would like to take this discussion further. So we are joined by a panel of experts as well, both from, from the academia perspective, from the civil society, as well as the industry. So let me first invite Professor Michael from, he's Dean at the School of Architecture at Jindal Global University for his inputs on the both sides of water with and without technology.
That's a great introduction, and thanks for the presentation, Anthony. I've had your book at my office for quite a few years too, so I've been preparing these questions for quite a while. Let me start off maybe just touching on 3 points and ask for your reactions or comments as opposed to a question. The first has to do with perhaps more of a mythopoetic understanding of the rivers in general, aside from the sacredness of the Ganges River. Going back to Heraclitus, who said you can never step in the same river twice, that rivers are seen as almost in a sense having an essence to them that is uncapturable, unrepresentable, the fact that it's more of a continuous flow. Or perhaps under, say, Hesse in his Siddhartha novella, where the river becomes a symbolic device for transformation that recurs and drives narratives and drives spiritual quests. I would lump a lot of that literature into the mythopoetic, and maybe you could talk in a minute about if you sensed any of that or if you bracketed that out of the research when you were doing it. The other side of it, and this is what you were just prompting me to discuss, has to do with the technologies or the river itself as a technology. And I heard some traces here, perhaps unintentional, of people like Lewis Mumford and his Technics and Civilization, who points out the medieval origins of modern industrialism and particularly extraction technologies as all being medieval inventions. And Patrick Geddes with the idea of the region as being part of the river. But even something like contemporary theorists like Manuel de Landa, who in all honesty said that the Mississippi River is a machine for sorting rocks. And there's a lot of techniques and technicity in and around the river that's alluded to in the photographs in your personal narratives of discovery that may or probably don't show up as much in the technical drawings of the data, which was obviously capturing different types of flows. So I guess, one of the things I'd like to know is how much of that mythopoetics was bracketed out, or how did it inform the mapping exercise? And same thing is, what sort of undiscovered or unimagined technologies and techniques influence the making, not just the technologies you made, but the technologies you saw being used in and around the river, everything from harvesting water to washing to sacred rituals and such. So I'm creating a pretty much a 19th century spectrum here between the mythopoetic and the technological. And then my follow-up question is going to be about how rivers function as a type of mass media, but I'll hold that one for a minute. Anthony, do you have any comments?
Certainly, and thank you, Dr. Thomas and Dr. Wilton, for those questions and comments. With respect to the kind of mythopoetic, for me, one of the things that I write about in the book, and that was really inspirational in the work that I do, is Gangah's descent, as it's told in the Ramayana, right? So for me, the fact that Ganga is so great that she will break the earth, that she has to be caught in Lord Shiv's hair, I think is a really wonderful metaphor, but also way of thinking about rivers, because we're not thinking of then a river as two parallel lines, but instead as literally Shiv's sopping wet hair. And so I think it's a great metaphor for how we think about the river as a watershed, as a basin. So for me, and this also I think ties in with some of the comments that Dr. Wilton mentioned, which is how do we not think of the river as just one thing, but as many? And where does Ganga end and begin? Because I think given that it's a monsoon-fed river, in so many ways, it's almost atmospheric.
Yeah.
And I think the way that if we think about water table levels and how those are connected to the river, Ganga in a way is a river without banks. And so one of the things I look at in the book then is the way in which this monsoonal landscape is so dynamic, not just in terms of its surface water bodies, but also its groundwater bodies. And so I look at then the history, and this ties into, I think, your second question about technology. In the book, I look at the transformation of this river basin into a giant water machine with the Ganges Canal system that's begun under the East India Company. Today, it's the longest canal system in the world, over 12,000 kilometers. So it's a highly centralized system. But by the end of the 19th and certainly by the early 20th century, you start to see it being embedded with decentralized water systems like tube wells. And so I look at the tube well revolution and how that is so tied very much to Ganga's history and story. So I really try to understand the river as a watershed, and then through these transects, which of course comes from Alexander von Humboldt, Patrick Geddes, who did so much work in India, was very interested in that valley section.
Yeah.
And I try to bring all of that to layer the technologies of centralization and decentralization and how they intersect with these terrestrial sites that are imbued with celestial significance for so many millions of Hindus. So it's a little bit like when I do a longer presentation, I oftentimes show Luke Skywalker's arm from The Empire Strikes Back, where, you know, Darth Vader cuts it off. And so he has a mechanical arm, but it still looks humanoid as well. For me, Ganga is very much a kind of cyborg in that way. It's co-authored by humans and non-humans alike. And that kind of nature-culture divide just doesn't work in a context like this because they're so entangled. And so for me, that's what's so rich about studying Ganga, because I think at a more distant level, more and more of the world is going to look like the Ganga Basin in terms of flooding and droughts. And there's so much we can learn from the uses and misuses of technology and the kind of politics and social conditions that exist here. So I don't know if that leads up to then to your third question about mass media, but those would be my attempts at trying to be as concise as possible for your question.
Okay. No, thanks a lot with that. And, you know, I'm a big fan of cyborgs, and it's interesting that, you know, the first Terminator was the meat machine interaction of Arnold Schwarzenegger, and they increasingly became liquid metal cyborgs and became more river-like. So there's something in that. But I guess also with your emphasis in the title too about imprecision and the fact that you developed almost a quasi-scientific, you know, low-tech, high-tech, no-tech method of mapping and collecting the data. But I'm also thinking about imprecision in relationship to flows and rivers and data too. There's a way to reread your work perhaps a little bit disembodied from the actual geography of it, and to think about, you know, low-res representations, you know, lossy signals, you know, fuzzy logic. All of that seems to be implied in the moment that you add precision to maps. You also have to map the imprecision as a, you know.
Professor Anthony, I must say that, you know, you have a panelist who has read your book cover to cover. So in fact, you know, very appreciative of your comments, Professor Michael, there. Allow me to, you know, go over to the other panelists in the meanwhile. Mr. Shirshendu Banerjee is with us. He also has been one of our master speakers, as Dr. Michael has been. He comes from the sound industry, and you know, in the modern day and age, the relationship between water and sound is extremely ecstatic. So Shirshendu, over to you. Your comments. Please unmute yourself.
Well, good evening, everybody. Good afternoon, wherever you are. I generally have a question, which is beyond the scope of sound. The question essentially is probably a little more from John Lennon than anything else. Is that, the Ganga is part of our culture. Not only is it our mother river, but a lot of our lives are entangled with it. And it's a utopic thought, but I have always felt what it would be like if we were not to pollute that river in any way, whether it be through, even a leaf or even an offering. Is it possible that we can stop uh, polluting that river in any which way? And what its effects would be, because we also face a huge problem of pollution of this river. And I understand that this question might not exactly be in line with what has been spoken about, but there it is. And thank you very much.
Couple of things here. One, of course, I'm sure Professor Anthony, since he has really worked at the basin level, so he would be in a position to answer it from the field. But in between, an interjection here, I would invite Dr. Arvind Kumar. He is country's best known water expert. He runs a think tank called India Water Foundation, and he has also worked equally well in the area of water. So, Dr. Arvind, your quick comments on the presentation as well as what Shishyendu said.
Yeah, dear distinguished colleague and notable audience and professor, I actually listen all the discussions. I trust everybody, one of you is keeping safe in COVID time. So friends, I'm actually discussing about another aspect of this Ganga. Sustainability has become the cornerstone for development efforts since early 2000s, and with the last decade of action to achieve SDG goal 2030, preserving the sanctity of river Ganges is significant. The year 2020 demarcated as a super year for nature and diversity, it has unfolded new vistas of multiple opportunities toward finding a green pathway that focuses on sustainable narratives alongside preserving the riverine ecosystems and build a mutually supportive relationship with the Ganges to help us build back better. The river Ganges lifeline to 450 million people, and the people of India are attached religiously, spiritually, and emotionally run its course of over 2,500 kilometers from the Gangotri in the Himalayas to the Ganga Sagar in the Bay of the Bengal through 11 Indian states. It is one of the most vital lifeline of the India's economy, catering to the livelihood, drinking water, agriculture, other related requirements of the about 40% of the India's total population. And during lockdown, everybody see, we could witness Ganges fit for drinking purpose and dolphin re-emerging in their natural habitats. Broadly speaking, years now, the plight of the river Ganga is now not new, and this predicament has been persistent for many years now. With the exception of COVID time, the river is contaminated from the various towns that has grown in the banks of the Ganges, and even one of them equally responsible for this. Industrial waste.
Arvindji,
yeah.
let me ask you a question on the presentation that Professor Acciavatti made.
Yeah.
What would be your observation? I mean, he has done it from an academic as well as a traveler's perspective. Your work is different from the implementation perspective. So quickly, if you could take just a minute commenting on the work that he has done.
In my opinion, actually, he did a tremendous work, and his study, it take long time, maybe I think 2 decades or so. So I think his study is useful for the purpose for the researcher in this field, and surely this will help the people in that field. Yeah, and there is a need for a specific emphasis on changing cultural attitude, which has long at the Ganges to have self-purifying properties. So he actually covered all the most of the aspect, religious aspect I saw, and other aspects too. So definitely it's very helpful, and I'm completely convinced with his thoughts and ideas and his actually work, a long work. Yeah.
That's great. Let me now, Wilton, come over to you. So you have heard, two water experts here. So one from across the seven seas, and the one that works here very much in the country. So you are standing somewhere in between as a bridge. So how is it that A, in terms of knowledge, B, in terms of building a technology bridge, not only in terms of better implementation and taking this knowledge and translating into action. So how is it that the ICT, or while the tools or the technologies that we talk are actually available, but mapping and then implementation going on that part. So what possibly can be done? Please unmute yourself.
See, as I said, technologies are available, intentions are there, but the biggest challenge what we face and what governments face is a data exchange, because there is no policy as such on data itself. Now, when I'm saying there is a work which has been done by Professor Anthony, or there is a work which has been done by Dr. Arvind Kumar, it is residing within their domain. It is residing with them only. So there is no exchange of data or transfer of knowledge or exchange of data, which should happen within interdepartmental also. The department A is mapping the Ganga basin, and the department B is again mapping the Ganga basin for their different purposes. So technologies are there, intentions are there, but the biggest challenge right now is exchange of data, because as there is no data policy as such available. uh, Using the technology, yes, everything and anything is possible as on today as we speak, because I mean, job can be divided, can be collaborated on different platforms. There are tools available like mobile workstation, and which you can, or data science machine, which you can take on the field and can do whatever you want to do with the data available to you. But first we have to have a data policy in place. There are a lot of scientists available, they have done their own job, they have done their own research, but everything is reside within the books or within their domain.
Yeah. Well, so that's a good perspective. But Professor Anthony, I would like to ask you, on a totally a different note. What is it that inspired you to carry out this study of Ganga Basin?
Well, before I answer that, I just want to say thank you for the questions, comments, and suggestions, Dr. Kumar and Dr. Wilton. And with respect to what inspired me, the short answer is that I grew up not far from the Mississippi River Basin. I grew up in the Mississippi River Basin in the United States, and I lived in New Orleans. I lived in Rome, Italy, along the Tiber, and I developed a romance for rivers and architecture. And I knew that I wanted to study a major river basin when I finished my undergraduate education in the US. And so I looked at the Amazon, the Nile, and the Gungah. And I just became completely captivated by Gungah, because here, world's most densely populated river basin, it's agriculturally productive, it's monsoonal, it has this incredible history. And yet I could find no contemporary maps or drawings of it. And so I really thought this would take me 1 year, and then I would finish this work and I'd go back to New York and work as an architect. And instead it took a decade to do. And I fell in love with doing the work and having to go and walk the area. I mean, from Gangotri Glacier, which for me, I'm from the middle of the United States, so it's extremely flat. So to see this incredibly beautiful glacier 4,000 meters above sea level is just quite striking. To all of the freshwater, to all of the Gungah dolphins that I saw, the susus, to the adventures that I got to have every day was really quite amazing. To the hundreds of thousands of tube wells that I counted and mapped out, every day was like a kind of adventure. So I was extremely lucky to get to do the work and enjoyed it so much, and just met so many wonderful people in villages, towns, cities, etc. So it's definitely a far cry from the life that I lead now, living in New York. But I try as often as I can to come back to India, because I obviously miss it quite a bit.
All right. Well, that's quite interesting, though. Look forward to well, that. This is only the time that we have for today's show. I wish we could continue for a little longer, then because it's quite an involved discussion that we've been having cross section of opinion coming from all around. Well, thank you very much. I can say at this moment, Professor Acciavatti from joining us, US, Dr. Arvind Kumar, Professor Michael, Mr. Shirshendu Banerjee, Mr. Kocher, Samir Kocher, and Rohan Kocher for being on the show, making it absolutely lively and informative for everyone. So thank you all once again and look forward to seeing you soon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
It was a pleasure to be with all of you. Thank you so much.